For the second and final part of the campaign for the American presidency, we are going to talk about what we haven't talked about yet. We're right here on the cusp of the two parties having their conventions, typically late summer, typically mid to late August, maybe early September. Um, and then, of course, there's a short run from that point, roughly September 1st to early November, so September, October. About a 2-month time frame here from the convention to the general election. All right, so let's get going. All right, so let's talk about those party conventions in the late summer. That's coming up here, of course, in the current electoral season for the presidency. The Republican National Convention, the Democratic National Convention. The way it's worked out, typically, almost always, is that these are essentially coronation ceremonies. The one with the most delegates is going to get that nomination, and that's typically been decided definitively relatively early on in the primaries and caucuses. So by the time you get to late summer, this is essentially a done deal. I mean, the last ones, the last primaries and caucuses, I believe, are in mid-June, and those are super late as it is. So by the time you get to late August, it's over. There's almost always a very clear front runner who's going to win that nomination. So in some ways, there's not too much drama. The media used to be required by the government to cover both conventions, gavel to gavel, which was insane. That's no longer the case, obviously. So typically, the media will provide only minimal coverage of these conventions because honestly, they're not all that interesting. What happens at these conventions? Obviously, somebody is nominated and is officially declared to be the candidate for the presidency for that party. The platform of the party is constructed. That's important for party insiders, important for almost nobody else. Right? This is where we stand on the Affordable Care Act. This is where we stand on abortion. This is where we stand on same-sex marriage, and so on. What is dramatic about the convention is typically this is where the presidential candidate will announce their vice presidential candidate. That's kind of a big deal. That's a way to build some interest in these conventions. And I think we've talked about this. So some presidents will choose somebody who they think will help them win the general election. Others will choose someone that they believe will help them govern if elected. Examples of the latter would be Obama choosing Biden, and then W. Bush choosing Dick Cheney. I think for McCain back in the day, he announced his early because he was trying to beat W. Bush. Sarah Palin, he hoped, would clearly not help him govern, God forbid, but would help him maybe win the election. Didn't work out that way, but I think that was the hope. Okay, so what else is significant about these conventions? Primetime speeches. Typically, each party will identify a rising star or rising stars and give them a primetime speaking slot when the media might actually be covering the convention. And so you will often get, let's say, a Bill Clinton giving a speech at, gosh, that must have been, who would that have been? Maybe the Dukakis, or who was it who ran after him? I honestly can't remember, but whoever the Democrat was prior to Clinton, who did not win the general election, I think they featured Clinton for a primetime speech, get some attention. Ronald Reagan, when Gerald Ford was nominated, Reagan gave a primetime speech. Obviously, next time around, Reagan was the nominee. Same for Obama. So this is a chance for each party to identify rising stars and give them a chance. I think the Republicans last time around gave Bobby Jindal a chance and he fluffed it. So some of them make good on it, some of them don't. A couple other things really quickly. These conventions can be strategic. The best one I can think of is the Republican convention in 2004. It was going to be a close race. The decision was made to have the convention on September 11th of that year, 2004, with the obvious symbolic significance of 9/11. And it was held in New York City, right? Counterintuitive. New York City, home ground for liberal Democrats. But the idea here was let's go to part of the ground zero for 9/11. And that was brilliant, right? Brilliant marketing by the GOP. Decision made, I believe, by Karl Rove. So who did they feature at that convention? Primetime speeches as a way to market the W. Bush candidacy in 2004 in what promised to be a close election. Karl Rove, again, brilliantly chose Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? Moderate Republican from California, very popular, obviously, to give a speech. Not a rising star necessarily, but somebody who would help market the GOP as friendly to independents, middle of the roaders, moderates. Rudy Giuliani, a 9/11 hero, Republican, but also had been, right, mayor of New York City. So again, a centrist Republican, because the knock on W. Bush was that he was too conservative to win the general election against John Kerry. So you market the party as relatively centrist. Whether it is or not is a different question, but that's how you market it. Arnold Schwarzenegger, brilliant choice. Rudy Giuliani, brilliant choice. And the third one, a guy named Zell Miller. At the time, I believe he was a senator from Georgia. He was a Democrat, although he was a conservative Democrat who endorsed W. Bush over John Kerry. So it was a way for the Republicans to stick a big old thumb in the eye of the Democratic Party. Hey, look, one of your own is endorsing the Republican. How about them apples? Plus, right, it was a signal. Hey, if you are a conservative Southern Democrat, you should consider voting for W. Bush over John Kerry. So this was brilliant strategic positioning by the GOP in 2004. The location of their convention, the primetime speakers, brilliant. Also, very quickly, you might want to check out that YouTube clip. What do political scientists fantasize about? A contested convention in which there is no clear front runner. A number of people could win. Typically, one of two people could win. That almost happened with Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, but Obama had just enough of a lead that he was able to win that thing cleanly. But the fantasy is a contested convention. You had something like that in Chicago in 1968 for the Democrats. It was not pretty. The mainstream candidate was Hubert Humphrey, right? LBJ's vice president, but he was seen as part of the whole Vietnam fiasco. He was seen as a war president, if you will, or a war presidential candidate. The more popular choice for Democrats, rank and file, was Eugene McCarthy. He was against the Vietnam War. And back then, too, look, most of the delegates were party bigwigs. The party elite back then still mostly controlled the conventions. These days, it's more party rank and file, participating through primaries and caucuses. Back then, primaries and caucuses were held, but they weren't that significant. Most of the delegates were party elite. So the party elite, the establishment, was behind Hubert Humphrey. Rank and file was behind Eugene McCarthy. Humphrey won easily, but it was profoundly contested and resulted in all sorts of difficulties for the Democrats that I think helped lead to Humphrey's defeat by Richard Nixon in 1968. So a fantasy, right, for political scientists to have a contested convention, but a nightmare for the parties. They don't want a contested convention. They want a party, a coronation ceremony. All right, so once each of the two major parties have chosen their nominee at the conventions in late summer, we roll into the general election season. The first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. That's American electoral tradition. So the date can vary from one cycle to the next, but it's always the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. What are you looking to do here as a candidate in the general election? Win! Win! How do you go about winning? Raise and spend big money, right? Raise and spend big money. Couple things here. We do have a federal matching dollars policy, and for a long time, that's what presidential candidates did. They signed up for that deal, and if they raised, let's say, $200 million by themselves, they would get $200 million from the feds, right? And then they'd have $400 million. Happy, bappy, easy peasy. Until the year 2008. It is a very young Barack Obama running against John Barack Obama's people told Barack, hey, we think we can raise way more money by ourselves than taking federal matching dollars, because it turns out to qualify for federal matching dollars, you have to limit how much you raise, right? But we'll double whatever you raise, but we're going to limit it. We'll double it, right? So you only have to raise half as much as what you end up with. And Barack Obama's people were like, yo, we think we can raise so much on our own that we can, do better than if we took federal matching dollars. So that's what they did. I don't know what the limits were back then, but let's say that you were allowed to raise $250 million and you would get $250 million, right? For $500 million, whatever. Barack Obama's people were like, we can raise $800 or $900 million on our own without federal matching dollars, and we'll end up with more money. So that's exactly what they did, and that's exactly what happened. John McCain felt like he had been kind of hoodwinked a little bit, right? He took the more standard route of taking the federal matching dollars. He had to limit how much he raised, and he ended up with far less money than Barack Obama. So in 2012, right, guess what? Both Barack Obama and Mitt Romney did not take federal matching dollars because that imposes limits on how much you can raise. Right? And ever since then, that's been the dealio. No presidential candidate in the general for the two major parties takes federal matching dollars. And the numbers now are just huge. Depending on how you count the money exactly, I believe Biden indirectly raised over $1 billion in 2020. Yeah. So that's shifted a little bit in recent years. You also focus on the key battleground states. That's been shifting lately, but what we have right now, Pennsylvania is the big one, Michigan, Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, and little old Nevada. Florida and Ohio used to be on the bubble, and they had a lot of delegates, right? So they got a huge amount of attention. Used to be you had the big three, Pennsylvania, Florida, Ohio. But lately, right, Florida and Ohio have been reliably Republican. They're no longer battleground states. They've fallen off the list. And they've been joined by smaller states, especially Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Nevada. Right? Those are the states that could go either way. And because of how we do the college, right, where if you win the popular vote in a state, you get all that state's delegates, which we computate by adding up the total number of senators and the total number of delegates you have at the House of Reps. Right? So Nevada gets what? 6, right? Because we have 4 members of the House and 2 senators. We get 6 delegates. Pennsylvania obviously gets a lot more. But these are the 6 right now where the vote is always around 50-50, right? In every other state, for the most part, you already know ahead of time that in a close election, the Democrat's going to win California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, right? No brainers. Why campaign there? You don't. It'd be wasted effort, wasted money. Republicans, right? You're going to win in a close election. Republicans are going to win. Right? Mississippi, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, Texas. Right? You're going to win those states. Done deal. You shouldn't campaign there. It's a waste of your time and money. Right? So because of our electoral college, it's one of the weird impacts of our electoral college, which, there's some pros and cons there. I tend to think more cons than pros. But I think as a political scientist, one of the big cons is it means that most states don't matter in a presidential election, right? Because they won't be very close, and all the delegates are going to go to one side or the other. So no one campaigns there. No one campaigns there, hardly. Maybe unless you're doing a fundraiser. Right? That might draw candidates to California, right? LA, San Francisco. If you're there to raise money, you might go to California. Otherwise, no reason to go to California. That's nuts. That's our biggest state. No reason to go to Texas unless you're raising money. That's crazy. Instead, it's, these 6 states. That's where it's all happening, people. That's the action in presidential elections. 6 states. What are you looking to do in this general, right? Win those 6 states, as many of them as possible. The more you win of those states, the more likely you are to win the college. That's where the action is. Tell your stories to voters, right, about who you are and what you're going to do and what you have done, and you attack your opponent. Of course you do. People say they don't like negative campaign ads, but they work. The evidence is that they work. So lots of negative campaigning on both sides. You do the debates. Those still seem to matter. I don't know. Color me skeptical. We're not looking for someone who's a good debater. We're looking for someone, who we want as our president. And those, I think, are not quite the same thing, or maybe not the same thing at all. We still do debates. I don't know that they make much of an impact. I don't know how relevant they are, but we still do them. I do have on there, right on the slide, don't screw up, right? Watch what you say. That used to be the conventional wisdom, for sure. Not anymore. Not anymore, at least for Donald Trump. Now, he might be a one-off. We'll see. But Trump, right, has demonstrated you can screw up a lot, and screw up super badly. Like, be criminally indicted, be impeached twice, right? Lose a sexual assault case in civil court. Also, you can do all sorts of horrible, screwy things, and you're fine. And you're fine. Oh, man, that is quite a shift from the past, let me tell you. All right, so as examples of how this has gone the last two times, let's look at 2016 ever so briefly, and 2020 ever so briefly, and maybe anticipate 2024. In 2016, Hillary Clinton, although we'll say now, right, that she ran a terrible campaign and she was a terrible candidate, she ran a perfectly good campaign and she was a perfectly decent candidate, right? If you're looking for perfect, don't look at American elections because people are not perfect. Our candidates are far from perfect because we're far from perfect. So anyway, Clinton runs a perfectly good campaign. She's a perfectly good candidate, right? She wins the national popular vote by over 2%. Not shabby. I couldn't do that. I'd be lucky if I get 2.1 votes in a national election, right? But right, what did it come down to? Those 6 states, right? Those 6 states that we just got done talking about. That's where the action is. If you don't win at least 3 or 4 of those states, you're not going to win the presidency, right? And she lost 5 out of those 6. Of the 6, the only one she won was little old Nevada, and that didn't help much because Nevada's small. I think the big 3 there, I believe, in terms of number of delegates, are Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Yeah, so what did Trump do? Almost miraculously, he won Pennsylvania by the skin of his teeth. He won Michigan barely. He squeaked by in Wisconsin. Close call in Arizona. Barely squeaks by in Georgia. Kaboom! He gets all the delegates for those 5 states. He's on his way to the White House. That's how it works, right? The national popular vote is like a beauty contest, right? It doesn't really matter. It's insignificant. It's symbolic only. You got to win state by state in those 6 states, period. It's a heartbreak for Hillary Clinton and a semi-miraculous win for Donald Trump. In 2020, almost like cosmic justice, right? The tables are flipped. Biden, in this case, wins the national popular vote by almost 4.5 percentage points. Wow. And more critically, because that's only a beauty contest, more critically, right, he wins all 6 of the battleground states. All 6. He runs the table, almost miraculously, by super thin margins in every one of those 6 states. Holy crap, you couldn't make this stuff up if you were writing a script for a movie. He wins all 6 by super thin margins, agonizingly thin margins. All right? Heartbreak for Donald Trump. And baseless claims that he was cheated out of his victory. He was not. He was in the same spot as Hillary Clinton. But at least Hillary Clinton could argue, bloody hell, right? I won the popular vote. I feel a little screwed over. Trump lost the popular vote by a lot, and he lost the college, and he lost all 6 battleground states. albeit by incredibly thin margins. Yeah, so basically, the election hardly matters in 44 of our 50 states. That's a crime. That's a crime. And the District of Columbia, they also get electoral college votes. I think they get 3. And of course, the Democrat always wins there by about, and I'm not making this up, they typically win by about 80 points in the District of Columbia. And then the territories, right, don't get a voice. Guam, Puerto Rico, Northern Marianas Islands, forget about it. You don't matter. Maybe they should and maybe they shouldn't, but they don't. All right. 2024. Wow. I have no crystal ball. Be super cool if I did. I do believe, although things could change, and I've been wrong lots of times in the past, it looks like it'll be a rematch of the 2020 election. Right, no one's too hyped about that, but here we go. 2 extremely elderly white guys. That sounds familiar, but they're really old this time. Yeah, they're going to battle it out, much like they did in 2020. Yeah, so it'll come down to those 6 states, people. Eyes on the prize, right? Look at those 6 states. Track what's happening in those 6 states. The other 44 don't really matter unless there's an upset. Right? Don't really matter. If I had to call it now, right, we know, right, that the electorate is always changing, and we know that Trump draws most of his support from those 50 and over. Biden gets most of his support from those under the age of 50. And what happens to the elderly in America over time? Oddly enough, they die. And so, right, that's Trump's problem. We've talked about that. His key supporters are literally dying and leaving the electorate, right? And they're being replaced by young people who are super not into Donald Trump. Yeah, what's the age demographic that supports Trump the least? 18 to 24. Who's replacing the elderly as they die off in the electorate? 18 to 24-year-olds, right? So the calculus with each succeeding cycle, unless something changes, it gets more and more challenging for Trump and the Republicans. And for now, they're locked into that, and they got to just do a ride or die thing. So if I were to predict, and predictions are a fool's game, but why not? I'm a bit of a fool myself. I would say Biden will probably win the popular vote by at least 5%. I think that gap will continue to grow. He'll roll up huge wins in states like California and New York and New Jersey and Illinois. Now, who will win the correct number of the battleground states? That's much harder to tell. Gosh. It's boring, right? But I'll say 2024 might look similar to 2020. I think it's going to be close again. I don't think, and this is just pure speculation, of course, I don't think it'll be as close as it was in 2020, but what do I know? I say that if I had to call it now from a distance, Babe Ruth calling a shot, I would say, yeah, Biden, assuming he lives, assuming Trump lives. Neither one of those is a guarantee and far from it. But assuming both survive physically until after the election, probably Biden slides by. Probably he slides by a bit more than he slid by in 2020. He probably wins all 6 battleground states, although maybe the margins aren't quite as thin as they were in 2020. But again, predicting the future, it's a fool's errand. But those are my predictions.